Sick of getting blisters? Stop slipping and just be comfortable with Pure Grip Socks Pro. Great fit, great comfort, lots of grip, and an even better price. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the Sokito Scudetta, a newcomer to the world of football boots, but based on the fit, feel, performance, and overall construction, you sure wouldn't know it. With a brand emphasis on bio-based materials from both natural as well as recycled sources, not to mention also technically fully vegan if that's your thing, the Scudetta is the brand's entry into the very competitive speed boot category, where in particular for 2024, there are so many amazing options, which of course, when you're talking about the unknown, calls into question, why would you buy a Scudetta over what you know is already good? Well, I'd argue there's two reasons. Reason number one being the price, where as of right now, these retail for 200 euros, which is the equivalent of about 220 US dollars. Not insanely inexpensive, but definitely a little bit less than what you would pay from the usual suspects from Nike, Adidas, and Puma. But I think the main reason why most people might want to consider the Scudetta is because it truly is the reincarnation of one of the greatest speed boots of all time. And that's the 2014 F50 Adizero. If you loved these, you're going to love the Scudetta. But of course, like any football boot, it's not all perfect, which is why in today's video, we're gonna go over the good, the bad, how they fit and feel on feet, and ultimately determine whether or not the Sokito Scudetta, a complete unknown in the football boot market, might be something that you'd want to consider. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, watch the entire review, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, no SR4U coupon codes as of yet, sorry about that, maybe that'll change in the future, but they will be available via the first link down below. And as always, if you enjoy the unsugar-coated, brutally honest reviews on this channel, don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2024. So first things first, let's talk about the upper, which is basically made up of two main components, or I guess two separate materials that both serve a purpose as it relates to feel, comfort, as well as general performance of the football boots. Where at the front, you're going to find a BioTouch Vamp, which is a very soft, almost leather-like material, but is obviously a synthetic. It's super thin, giving you that barefoot touch, and is also lined with this really soft kind of synthetic suede microfiber on the inside that just feels really good against your foot. This obviously covers the entire toe box forefoot and medial side of the midfoot, and then transitions very clearly into a non-stretch type material, which is there for the sake of structure, lockdown, as well as overall responsiveness. Basically a textile-based synthetic material that's borderline see-through, that is still super pliable, but is definitely a lot stiffer than what you'll find towards the front part of the boot. That slowly flows into more of kind of a knit type material at the back where there is no structure. All you're going to find from a structure standpoint is this external heel counter. This being very soft makes for great comfort, which we'll talk about in just a second. And they've also opted for a more traditional U-throat construction with a central lacing system. Where if we compare the elements of the Scudetta to the 2014 F50, you have a thin hybrid touch, very leather-like, but also soft synthetic material in the main part of the foot, making contact with the ball. It transitions into a speed foil, textile-based, more rigid, structured synthetic for the sake of overall lockdown. It too features an external heel counter with no real structure to the back of the heel, and then you'll also find a standalone tongue with a U-throat construction and standalone lacing system. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that the Scudetta is a copy of the 2014 F50 Adizero. At the end of the day, these football boots are now 10 years old, and there truly isn't anything currently on the market that compares that closely to these. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and effectively what Sokito have done here is given us all the elements that made this football boot special in their own unique design and package, which in some ways you might argue is better, and in some ways you might argue isn't quite as good. But regardless of which side of the argument you're on, the fact that we have anything even close to a 2014 F50 in 2024 is something that I think a lot of people should be super excited about. With the general quality of the upper probably being the most impressive aspect of this boot, this BioTouch material just feels fantastic on the ball. The grip texturing that they have on the surface is very subtle, but definitely noticeable and does give you that little bit of extra grip, more so in dry conditions rather than wet in my experience, but it does do its job in terms of just not leaving the upper completely slick. From a lockdown and responsiveness standpoint, the upper as a whole is very thin and doesn't have a ton of structure to it, so you're not necessarily going to get the most responsive feel when making quick cuts and changes of direction, but I definitely don't think that it stands out in a negative way when compared to other speed boots on the market because it fits so well. The boots as a whole do end up feeling quite responsive, and I do love the fact that it does utilize a central lacing system with a standalone tongue because of this U-throat design. My one gripe with the tongue would be the fact that the bottom part is that BioTouch, which is really nice, but then it transitions into this kind of flimsy, almost microfiber type material that has no real structure to it. So you kind of have to fiddle with it a little bit when you put the boots on because it will bunch up on itself as it just inevitably sticks to your socks. And then something that's really, really small, but I know some people would want to know about it, and that is the fact that there are actual holes in the bottom as well as the top part of the tongue, which means that there is going to be some level of breathability, but also if it's a little bit wet or even when it's not wet, dirt gets in quite easily. And obviously from a waterproof perspective, not that any football boot is waterproof, but water will get in very, very quickly if it's present. And it's a small thing, but a detail worth pointing out is the fact that they did give you that extra lace hole at the top, where if you do find for whatever reason that the lockdown in the heel just isn't working for you, or it just doesn't feel quite as secure as you would like them to, they give you that deeper anchoring point with that additional lace hole to help hold your heel down. At the end of the day, it's impossible to make one shape of football boots that's going to work well for everybody. So the fact that they've included that is something that I really do appreciate. And honestly, I'm not sure why every brand doesn't do it. Moving to the rear, the boot does of course have a low cut design where you have a little bit of a knitted mock collar with an extension piece here at the back. That effectively doesn't really do anything. And then like I mentioned, no real structure. It's very similar in construction. Again, if we're not comparing it to the 2014 F50 Adizero, it's kind of like what you would get on a Mizuno Morelia Neo, which again, not a bad comparison to make whatsoever. Tons of padding in the heel liner itself, a really soft kind of microfiber material that grips your socks well too. So from a comfort and lockdown perspective, I found this to be fantastic out of the box. No issues with discomfort whatsoever. Lockdown was also great. Then the insole fully removable, I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It is pretty much par for the course in terms of what you're going to find from most top-end football boots. A mesh liner on the surface, some perforations through the forefoot, and it's made from a single layer of this white foam that's maybe a little bit thicker than what you would find from some major brands, but ultimately pretty similar to what everyone else is doing. Moving to the base, I would say the Scudetta's Soleplate design is stereotypical speed boot in a lot of ways, which is definitely not a bad thing. It's a plastic construction, which makes for overall a relatively lightweight package. It does have that external heel counter directly attached to the sole plate itself, which I'm personally a big fan of. It's all part of one mold. And then you have some kind of spining rigidity or reinforcement through the midfoot. Of course, being that this is a speed boot, I think the expectation from many these days is a responsive feel out of the forefoot. And this is really where I have my one major issue with this design, where when you bend the forefoot, the bend point, or I guess most flexible weak point of the sole plate, is in the midfoot, which for as much structure as this has, if all of it's going to buckle there, then really are you going to get that spring back effect from the sole plate? No, not necessarily. Granted, I think a responsive sole plate is one of those performance enhancers that's very suggestive. I don't think any one of these speed boots, even with the most responsive sole plate, is necessarily going to make you faster. And I will also say that I really had no issues with the feel of this sole plate underfoot. But if you're looking for a little bit of that kind of stiffer, more responsive sensation, you're not necessarily getting it from these. And then as far as the FG stud pattern is concerned, it's relatively straightforward in terms terms of being blades all the way through. Pretty standard in layout, 4 under the heel, 3 on either side of the forefoot, and then a chevron blade kind of supporting right in the middle of the forefoot. And they are relatively narrow in profile, meaning that they dig into the ground really nicely and provide plenty of bite. So as far as comparing this to other speed boots on the market, it's again very difficult to measure performance when it comes to this type of thing. But on natural grass in particular, I think these dig in really well and will feel pretty much as aggressive as anything. While it might be a simple layout, it's an effective one. And then there's the weight, where given that the Scudetta is a speed boot, the expectation once again should be that they are pretty light. And just to give it some context, because I'm not sure that everybody has the different weights of all the speed boots memorized, we're gonna weigh them side by side with the current F50 Elite, both in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the F50s, which you can see weigh in at 6.7, 6.8 ounces, the equivalent of 192 grams. Remember those numbers. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Scudetta, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.1 ounces, the equivalent of 201 grams, which means the Scudetta weighs about 10 grams more than the current F50 in the same size. Granted, this is a more expensive pair of football boots, and I don't think that at 7.1 ounces, these are necessarily heavy, but if you are looking for that kind of blown away lightness type sensation, you're not necessarily gonna get it from these. It's also worth noting that on Sokito's website, they specify the weight at 182 grams. Granted, they don't specify which size boot they weighed, and obviously this being a 9.5, if you weighed a smaller size, they would also weigh less, but just be aware that 182 grams would only technically apply to a small, if not the smallest size. The fit and feel on feet is nothing short of excellent. I think this is one of the best feeling uppers in the speed boot category without a doubt. I love the BioTouch synthetic material, not only because of that really soft lining that it has, it's just so pliable and has the perfect amount of structure, but also stretch to it, where it wraps your foot very, very closely, as you would want any thin, barefoot feeling speed boot to do, but without squeezing your feet in a suffocating way. They've totally nailed that balance of tightness, structure, as well as stretch. And then of course you have that non-stretch material through the midfoot, which doesn't necessarily grab your foot too tightly to the point where it's uncomfortable. I think going with the U-throat construction and more traditional central lacing system allows for the perfect amount of adjustability, and the design and shaping of the heel, again, I thought was top notch. And if you do find that you have that little bit of slippage, they give you that extra lace position at the top to anchor your heel down into the boots and really just have that nice secure fit. The feel of the Soleplate underfoot, fairly standard. I would say it's just more flexible than anything, but doesn't really stand out in terms of the experience of playing in the football boots. And then from a width and sizing perspective, it's obviously a very tight fitting boot, as you'd expect a speed boot to be. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say that they are narrow. They will work for most people, and because of that nice open central lacing system, there is plenty of adjustability to be had. But A, if you don't like tight fitting football boots, or B, if you have excessively wide feet, they might not be the best option for you. Otherwise, if you've worn speed boots in the past, I see no reason why these won't fit you comfortably. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I am wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and I would say they run a smidge tighter in length than most boots that I wear in the same size. So if you like that tight fit, true to size is definitely the way to go. You'll get that little bit of stretch from that BioTouch material at the front that just works well after a little bit of wear time. But if you don't like your boots to be too tight in length, going up half a size might not necessarily be a bad idea. So in conclusion, I genuinely couldn't be more impressed with Sokito's first pair of football boots. For something that is completely new in every single way, it has a level of refinement that we very rarely see in football boots, period. When it comes to fit, feel, and overall performance, there's no question that these are as good, if not better, than the vast majority of top-end models that are out there right now. And obviously the angle of value for money is being pushed pretty hard, given that these do retail for around the $200 price point, which is less expensive than the competition, but not so much so where I think a lot of people are going to look at these and say, wow, I'm saving $40 over a pair of Vapor 16 Elites. I guess I'll buy a pair of Sokitos. I'm not sure that that's the core demographic. And at the end of the day, if you just want great value for money performance from a pair of speed boots, something like a Vapor 16 Pro for less than these will give you just that. Where I think these really stand out is in the way that they feel, particularly if you were a fan of that 2014 F50 Adizero. This, like I said, feels like the reincarnation of that. And from a speed boot perspective, when you're comparing this to everything that's currently on the market, where there are genuinely so many great options, none of them feel quite like the Scudetta.